The early Dreadnought era was a fascinating time in naval history, a period of rapid transformation as navies around the world rushed to adapt. Dreadnought herself had rendered entire fleets obsolete, prompting all major powers to develop counters and then counters to those counters, leading to, among other things, the South American and Anglo-German naval arms races. Ships were launched only to be quickly outclassed by newer designs, all within barely a decade. Because of this constant evolution, many of those early pioneering vessels are often forgotten. Today, we'll revisit that pivotal transitional period, focusing on the USS North Dakota, a ship frequently overlooked, even among her peers. Unlike her successor Utah, she never made it to the Second World War. In fact, when most people think of a battleship named Dakota, they recall one of the South Dakotas, either the unfinished Dreadnought or Battleship X herself. But today, that changes. Let's start with the story of the North Dakota's design, which marked an important and innovative step in early American battleship engineering. So, let's set the stage. When the United States entered the Dreadnought era, it did so with the USS South Carolina, a ship designed and built under strict tonnage limitations. Not due to international treaties, but simply because of what Congress was willing to fund. She introduced super-fearing turrets, a layout that would soon become the global standard. It suffered from an underpowered propulsion system, making us slower than many contemporaries and generally small by comparison. The Navy was well aware of these shortcomings, and when Dreadnought herself was unveiled, American designers immediately began planning a proper counter. The result was the Delaware class, a pair of ships largely free from the earlier weight restrictions. These new vessels were significantly larger than their predecessors. Where South Carolina had been closer in scale to North Dakota would actually surpass Dreadnought in displacement. She displaced 20,380 tons, increasing to 22,400 tons fully loaded. For reference, South Carolina came in at about 17,600 tons, while Dreadnought reached roughly 20,700 tons. That difference in scale extended to the hull as well. North Dakota measured 580 feet, 158 meters in length with a beam of 85 feet, 26 meters. By comparison, South Carolina was 452 feet, 138 meters long with a 24 meters beam. In Dreadnought, though, slightly longer, 527 feet, 160 meters, was actually narrower with a beam of 82 feet, 25 meters. With that context in mind, what did North Dakota bring to justify her greater size? The answer is simple: firepower. North Dakota carried 10, 12-inch 305 millimeters guns mounted in 5 twin turrets, the same number and caliber as Dreadnought, and 2 more than South Carolina, which had 8. Where North Dakota differed, however, was in turret arrangement. Unlike Dreadnought, all her main guns were mounted along the centerline, a significant improvement in efficiency. She featured a super fighting pair forward on the bow, with a third turret positioned behind the second funnel. The remaining 2 turrets were mounted back-to-back on the stern, not the most space-efficient design, but mechanically simpler than another super firing pair. Even so, this configuration allowed North Dakota to bring all 10 guns to bear on either broadside, compared to Dreadnought, which could only fire 8 at once due to her wing turrets. Not exactly a flaw, but a limitation of that design philosophy. To support her main battery, North Dakota also carried 14 5-inch guns, mounted individually in casemates, along with the standard submerged torpedo tubes of the era. 2 in total, 1 on each broadside. Armor protection ranged from 9 to 11 inches. 229, 279, mm, along the main belt, because North Dakota was built before the adoption of the Oler-Nethin armor principle. Her protection was more evenly distributed. Her casemate armor varied from 8 to 10 inches, 203 to 254 millimeters, while deck armor was fairly typical for the time, about 2 inches 51 millimeters. Thick power and propulsion where North Dakota truly stood apart was in her propulsion system. Although both North Dakota and her sister ship Delaware were fitted with 14 boilers producing 25,000 shaft horsepower through 2 shafts, they differed in engine type. Delaware retained traditional triple expansion engines, while North Dakota served as an experimental platform for the navies. First, steam turbine installation, a major technological leap. It was a situation reminiscent of the later Nevada and Oklahoma Class 1 adopting turbines. The other thing with reciprocating machinery, illustrating the Navy's cautious approach to emerging propulsion technology. Suffice it to say, North Dakota paved the way forward. Turbines, as they commento their own, were the way of their future. That said, as we come to the end of the design section, we can move into hot that meant in service. If you're wondering why this section was so long, it's simple, really. North Dakota would have a generally pretty quiet service life, with this story beginning in the Four River Shipyard in Quincy, Massachusetts, where North Dakota was laid down on December 16, 1907. The ship would be launched on November 10, 1908, and commissioned on April 11th of 1910. A bit over 2 years to complete, which is in keeping with other dreadnoughts of her time. On the other hand, her entry to service wouldn't be quite so simple. Or shortly after she joined their fleet, in September 1910, the ship suffered an explosion on September 8, 1910. The battleship was testing oil as fuel when an accidental explosion aboard North Dakota killed 3 men and set a fire in the engine room. Burning oil floated above a boiler while flames and smoke filled the area. This could have begun very badly had the fire spread. However, 6 brave sailors, August Holtz, Patrick Reed, Thomas Stanton, Carl Westy, Charles Roberts, and Harold Lippum waded into the engine room. Despite the flooding, the fire, and the smoke, these men shut off the boiler fire. In so doing, they helped prevent a potentially catastrophic blast. In addition to finding the bodies of the 3 lost sailors, 4 thieves likely saving the ship, the 6 men were each awarded the Medal of Honor, one of the highest proportions of Medal of Honor recipients per crew in their fleet, and certainly impressive forecoming during peacetime. That said, once repairs were complete, things would quiet down. North Dakota would sail to Britain and France in November 1910. Then she would spend the next 1911 through 1913 on training duty. Nothing particularly new and perfectly average for a peacetime battleship with one exception. On New Year's Day of 1913, North Dakota would be part of the honor guard escorting a British armoured HMS Naval carrying the remains of the United States ambassador. As an interesting note, and why always maintain, double check your sources. The Dictionary of American Naval Fighting Ships cites this as a Brazilian ship carrying the American ambassador to Brazil. Always, 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 always double check your sources. Bengus HMS NATO got the nickname Seahorse for this particular duty. That aside, North Dakota would be back to training duty after this, at least until 1914. While the Great War broke out in Europe, North Dakota would be the United States was at least at first neutral and preoccupied, sending troops though occupy Veracruz and Mexico. Thatu, North Dakota would be anchored off that port on April 26, 1914. 5 days after the occupation had begun, the battleship would sail up and down the Gulf of Mexico, protecting American interests, with the ship only returning home on October 16, 1914, whereupon the ship would be put through the ringer. The Navy intensified its training program with an eye towards being ready should war come to the United States. This wasn't quite as obvious as it would be 20 years later with the Second World War, but it remained a good precaution, because that war would come in April 6, 1917, with North Dakota and Chesapeake Bay on yet more gunnery. In this case, training duty. If she were called to action, that would have been helpful. However, Shua not. While Delaware would be sent to Britain, the same couldn't be said for North Dakota. She remained in home waters for the rest of the war. Not that Delaware got up too much beyond patrol duty, but at least she got to leave home. Then, again, North Dakota with her turbines was more valuable at home, where she could be put to use. Training generous for the rapidly, especially all those 4-stacker destroyers. Something amusing when one takes into account the actual reason the ship remained home. Admiral Hugh Rodman refusing to take her because he felt that North Dakota's engines were not reliable enough. Those engines would actually be replaced in 19 with newer model geared turbines along with new fire control equipment. Neither of which were put to use against the Central Powers, of course, but that is surely unique. In any event, when the war concluded, North Dakota would be sent to Europe at last. On November 13th, 1919, she carried the remains of the Italian ambassador back to Italy, after which made a grand tour of Mediterranean, Athens, Constantinople, Valencia, and Gibraltar. When that was done, it was back home and back to something that continued in 1920. With the exception of one event in July 1921, North Dakota played a modest but notable role in the bombing trials that led to the sinking of SMS. After those tests, she returned to training duties, a role that soon became her primary purpose. As any student of naval history knows, the end was already on the horizon with the signing of the Washington Naval Treaty in 1922. Most of the early dreadnoughts across all major navies were destined for the scrapyard. North Dakota and her sister Delaware were no exception. Both were set to be replaced by the new Colorado and West Virginia classes. Delaware was dismantled outright, but North Dakota was spared the torch, at least temporarily. She was decommissioned on November 22, 1923, disarmed, and converted into a radar-controlled target ship, an innovative role at the time. She served in that capacity throughout the remainder of the 1920s, until she was replaced by USS Utah in 1930. In 1931, North Dakota was finally scrapped, closing the chapter on a ship that had quietly bridged the gap between the earliest dreadnoughts and the more advanced battleships that followed. Even then, part of her lived on her turbines, were later reused during USS Nevada's modernization in the 1930 South. Humble end for a ship that helped pave the way for the modern American battle fleet. If you enjoyed this story from naval history, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. That way you won't miss the next deep dive into the ships, crews, and moments that shaped the seas.